I'm so excited to have Asher J joining us. Asher is an international adventurer and public figure whose compelling paintings, sculptures, installations, animations, ad campaigns, and films all have a single purpose: to incite global action on behalf of wildlife conservation. So her travels to the front line have made her a witness and storyteller, combating illegal wildlife trafficking, promoting habitat sanctuaries, and illuminating humanitarian emergencies. Her core message, again and again, is that we are losing our biodiversity during the Anthropocene, the age of man. So I'm going to bring Asher in live right now. Asher, how are you doing today? Oh, Asher, I think you're on mute.
Hi.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Second time's a charm. Pleasure.
Second time's a charm. Awesome. Well, Asher, it's so great to see you. It's been a while since we've connected. Every time we connect, you've always got some exciting project on the go, trying something new, approaching conservation in a different way. I'm so excited to catch up and see what you've been up to.
Wonderful. Yeah, a pleasure to be sharing what I'm going to be doing in the coming months and what I've been up to for the last year as well. So just a quick preface for those who don't know my background. I was in fashion designing, branding and marketing. I got into mass media communications for a while there and started utilizing mass media advertising methods and marketing for the benefit of communicating social agendas as well as environmental concerns of our time that people were oblivious of. And if people don't know, they won't be in an empowered capacity to participate, and they won't know their stake in the problem set as well as in the solutions. And therefore, I try to utilize where there's most amount of foot traffic, where there are most number of eyes, messages that would be easily accessible in a glimpse. And I did that for quite some time, for about 12 years. And then recently decided that, one person doing one campaign at a time can only scale so much impact. There's a level of inefficiency that I think technology can address. And I have thus started a tech startup right now in November 2020. And for the last year, I've been working on creating an application that is on blockchain. I know everyone's throwing that word around, and a lot of people in the environmental space have a lot of negative opinions and perspectives around blockchain, which some of it is informed and some of it is from a state of ignorance, because there are sweeping generalizations being made that I'm happy to counter. And then we are also integrating NFTs and smart contracts in ways that will empower consumers to be more mindful of their dollar spend and to show up from an informed capacity such that they can actually put their money to work in real time while also fulfilling their consumer needs. So nobody's going to stop consuming tomorrow morning. Like, we can't go from having been in a world of having access to material goods coming into our life, services coming into our life as and when we need it, and then suddenly say no to all of it, right? So then there is a need to address how we're doing that. Can we be mindful of it, and therefore look at more positive ways of spending those dollars, such that it's not coming constantly at the cost of non-renewable resources and people, as well as wildlife and wilderness areas. So that's really what fueled my passion, because I've been in the space long enough looking at where the deficits were. And I wanted to find a platform that would allow for both consumers and brands to have a more engaged and empowered position in the world, and they could hold each other accountable as well as maintain transparency in where dollars were going. So that's really what I've been focused on. But I'm going to walk you through sort of the problems and like my journey as to how I got here, and then happy to go into the application towards the end of it. So I'm just going to take you to my screen share of my Keynote. Oops, wrong deck. There we go. So yeah, I mean, like this particular thing, I titled it with incite, but it's also with insight. And I really think it's about that small shift, when things are seen, you can't unsee them. And then once you've seen them and acquired that insight, that moment of epiphany, it's very hard to turn a blind eye to those realities going forward, because you're already in the know. And when you know, you begin to care, you begin to love, and then you feel compelled to act. And that's really what's goaded my entire journey to relay information in the most intuitive ways that would galvanize an emotional response to what we were experiencing in the world around us, as opposed to taking it in as purely data. Because information, when it's just iterated in the capacity of numbers or words, we can understand it, but we don't really internalize it in a manner that is as second nature as a sensorial input. And that's why I think pictures are more universally accessible. And that's also why I'm using blockchain technology and NFTs, because we do live in a generation where that digital media can be used in truly powerful ways if it's allowed to retain its democratic and decentralized integrity, which allows for peer-to-peer interactions that allow for sharing of information, of understanding in a way that we've never experienced before. So there's a lot of wonder in technology that can link us back to the wonder that is in the tangible world, which I know, again, you know, blockchain and all of this is tethered to the metaverse and people trying to get further disconnected and disengaged with reality. And that's not what at all my positioning, because I am deeply rooted in the realities of the world and really care about the planet, and will do everything in my power to ensure that all of the work that I do contributes back to protecting its inimitable presence and magic. And speaking to which, I started creating a whole bunch of artworks that would condense complex information into two-dimensional graphics. So I started creating layouts that would contrast positive space with negative space and allow people to witness without having to explain it ad nauseum exactly what the core of the concern was. And therefore, if you could truly understand the question, within that question lies the answer. And that's really the design premise and process. It's when you sit with the question long enough, the answer emerges within its construct. And that's why the question has to be framed truly succinctly and in a manner that allows for you to get to the core, the source of what it is that you're trying to address, and not just stay at the symptom level, which we often do in the conservation sphere, as well as in anything to do with, you know, social injustices or everything that we participate in the world as such remains on surface level as opposed to addressing it at the source level. And that's why you keep seeing iterations of the same problem in the world. It's just it's the same retained patterns that are playing out instead of getting them addressed at a core level. So to get to the root of the issue, you know, I think seeing it as an image really does allow you to understand it in a way that's personal to your own known vocabulary, because then it's referencing back to your building blocks, and then you're able to connect the dots for yourself based on your own growth curve and life experiences and exposure to knowledge. So even when a person doesn't share the same value systems or beliefs or ideologies as you, when they see a visual, some of those motifs, especially because I tend to defer to silhouettes and iconographic elements that are easy to relate to, because you see them at airports, you see them all over the world. It's kind of inbuilt into our vocabulary in terms of semiotics. And so I try to find ways to integrate those same images or icons into visual layouts that would convey what I think is important to see in order for you to be able to participate as an informed consumer. And it is seeding that conscious mindset. So it's not about explaining, because, you know, you can explain ad nauseum and people just get, you know, bored or jaded or feel like, oh my God, here's another greenie or like a hippie or whatever the terms are, you know, that they want to assign in order to label you and push you away to the side and marginalize what it is that you're trying to communicate, as opposed to truly listen. And to create listening, you need to frame experience, and experience is easier because you're stepping into it and it's immersive, it's inescapable, and you are not given the option to leave. And it's coming to you at a pace and at a cadence that is congruous to your own learning curve, because you're taking it in on your terms, so you don't feel like it's forced and it's not a conclusion, unless, of course, the image or movie or visual that or or communication has been drafted in such a way that the agenda is so explicit that it saturates the person and they no longer want to engage with it. And that happens a lot too. And I think that's a lost cause, because you don't want to saturate anybody's mindscape or heart space with content that has such a strong agenda that it prevents them from framing and understanding and having an epiphany. So I always frame it around the question that I was led to ask, and that allows them to step into the same problem set and then come to a solution that they feel would be the best recourse to pursue. And in terms of experiencing, think about like shapes. Think about when you're looking at a topography, when you're looking at a specific animal and how it looks to you and how it could feel because you've made personal contact with it. In a rescue attempt, when I actually went out and cleaned oil slick birds, I know what that bird felt like. And to express that would be to bring that person into that moment in time, visually, sensorially, versus in a paragraph, which, yes, can be written so eloquently and elegantly that it does truly convey the emotional ethos behind that moment. But I think it's still a step in through a language conduit that could be a barrier to reach the many. And I think when you're looking at visuals, it's easier to bring them into it within even their own language or cultural context. They don't need to understand every aspect of your particular language deficit to be able to get it. Having said that, I have had experiences in the past where I've created campaigns in countries where I have had to think through the fact that they may not have the vocabulary for a certain concept, idea, or even for a way of categorizing something. For instance, in East Africa, when I was running a campaign against the bushmeat trade, we call it bushmeat, we call it, wildlife, we call it livestock. But in Swahili, they didn't have those kinds of differentiations. It's literally just like meat on feet. And so, it didn't matter whether you're culling wildebeest or you're eating livestock, it's still just meat on feet. And so I had to figure out ways to reach them on the terms and within the concepts that were familiar to them. And that's something I would highly encourage, is to always look at where people are at and meet them there. And it's the same thing with my application, the tech that I'm working on right now. I don't want anyone to have to know the tech stack in order to participate. That doesn't empower people. They should be met where they're at. It's about giving them the easiest step into the solution set, as opposed to making it barriers of entry every step of the way. So taking away the concept of crypto from it, taking away the aspect of having to buy into a tertiary wallet, like all these sort of pain points that keep you away from things because it's not familiar to you, is something that I want to take away in my application, so that you actually just enjoy the experience of being a part of a community that is engaged in being change makers, as opposed to being in this landscape of having to know the words, the buzzwords, and the lingo around the technology in order to feel like you're included, right, or accounted for. Again, with this other visual that I created last year, this was for FIU. They're going to be using this soon for the Shark Fest. And definitely look at Florida International University. They're doing extraordinary things for conservation around the world, and have extraordinary programs to offer their student body that even outsiders can partake in. So I would highly encourage you guys looking them up. But here's an image of like looking at the acoustic footprint of different biodiversity, and that they're not all expressing in the same frequency. So are we listening? And are we listening to the specific organism so that we receive them on their terms? Or are we listening through our filters and therefore only acknowledging that which we are predisposed to acknowledge? And that's where the anthropocentric bias comes in. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that these biases exist in science, in technology, and that we are creating infrastructure, implements, instrumentation, applications that are skewed by default based on the person who engineered them or brought them into existence, because an application or an instrument or a technology can only be as expansive and inclusive as the individual mindset that gave rise to it. So everything that we're doing in this world, and people like blame the technology, but that's just the tool, that's the conduit. What we should be looking at is the people that are spearheading those conduits. So I always encourage seeing, knowing, caring, loving, and acting. And I think it's impossible to to step away from your responsibility and your accountability to self and others. And that's something I wake up to daily. Like, how far is your sphere of impact? You know, is it just going to be within your household? Do you only care about those that live under your roof? Can you take it one step further and look at your backyard? Then you would think about clearing up anything that blows into your backyard. If you were to think a little bit further, you would be responsible for your neighborhood. You would want to go do anything that you can to protect the wildlife that might enter it, the birds that might fly into it. You would look to enrich the immediate context that you take responsibility for. And for me, my responsibility arcs over the entire planet. Like, I cannot wake up and hear about a oil spill in Peru and turn away from it. I am deeply affected by the fact that these realities are unfolding in that which I feel responsible for and feel the need to act within, and taking that action needs to come from a empowered space, which I didn't have for the longest while because I was deeply emotionally rooted in my responses, and that's very reactive. I would highly recommend everyone check in with themselves and not just get stimulated and entertained by what is unfolding to the point where it becomes dramatic and your responses to it are through jargon that you throw out in a heavy laden way that's doom and gloom narratives on social media. Rather, look at ways to empower the community around being part of the solution, because we so often focus on problems. And I did that for the longest while, right? I was creating campaign upon campaign that focused on the problems, because I was like, if I frame the question and get people into the problem set, they're going to get the solutions for their own sake. But all I wound up doing was constantly framing the problems that people were witnessing. And yes, they got the problem, but then I should have offered the solution in the next visual, which took me a while to get to, because I myself was a cause, selling more causes. So like, that's why I'm so deeply and emotionally identified with causes, because I felt like one myself. And I think it's so important to shift out of that mentality and feel like the solution set, and therefore all you witness and manifest around you is the solutions. Here are some more visuals that I created back in the day that were about the plastics issue, when we were dumping disposable bags and they were all ending up in the oceans, or when we're fishing without any awareness of where the wildlife was coming at or what bycatch it was resulting in, how much we were depleting the world's oceans. Are we truly conscious to read between the lines? Because as a consumer, you go into a Whole Foods market, or you go into any place and you bar scan at the point of checkout, all these living organisms, they were alive literally the day before, and you're taking them home as carcasses. And that is something you need to be holding yourself accountable, because that's your consumption footprint. And being mindful from day one allows you to curtail. Even if you don't want to give it up, you can start curtailing just how much you take, how rapaciously you take, and how myopically you do so. Because it's a fact that we all tend to stay within our immediate silo, and it's so easy to get disengaged from your impact in the world around you, because all you're looking at is just today. You're looking at right now. I'm like, I want to eat lunch. I'm going to go get this. But are you really thinking that choice through to the point of seeing where it came from and all the ripples it results in the world around? Same goes for your end impact. Like when you are putting litter out there, when you're putting things in your trash cans in your household every day, that culminates in the weekly trash pickup, or when you take it to the curbside in New York or anywhere else that you live, I would highly encourage you look at just how much of that truly needs to end up in the landfill. Can you be more conscientious about what you take home to begin with, so you don't end up putting so much of it in the landfill? Because all of it, again, bioaccumulates and biomagnifies through the ecosystems and ends up in the world's oceans and the world, period. And then it comes back to us. Like right now with the Swiss Alps is getting precipitated upon with microplastics, because plastic is now in a hydrological cycle. So are we really paying attention to the fact that we're polluting the very systems that nourish and nurture us and give us the context to do everything that we wake up to do every day, right? Including your professions. And then the other side of it, like I was looking at, sort of carbon acidification, ocean acidification because of carbon emissions, and then looking at the CO2 emissions that was occurring around the world due to our predisposition to a fossil fuel based economy. And what were the ramifications of that? Like literally the quickest way of showing it is sort of hocus pocus in a pot that is cooking the world's oceans away out of negligence, because we're just creating this toxic stew. And the same thing goes for, Sherlock Holmes puffing away at the problem set. Is he actually coming upon the solution, though, that could be affected? And usually he is, but this is just alluding to the moment of that epiphany occurring. And so for me, it's been about like moving away from that into where you see now more of an emergence of a solution set. Like the first iteration of the campaign of evolution was around the fact that we were pumping life with death. And so you can see man evolve into the Grim Reaper. But in the second image, you can see sort of the division between the solution set that's playing tug of war with the problem set of the paradigm that has been. And if you were to go into wildlife trafficking, another series of campaigns that I created around a constant commodification of the world's finite wild living organisms into something that is just disposed of and used in the most frivolous ways. Oftentimes, it's not even delivering the benefits it claims to be delivering, or it's a matter of vanity. And so for me, to communicate those issues in terms of scale was really important, because we're killing an elephant every 15 minutes. We're killing a rhino every 7 hours. I mean, these numbers might have gone up in recent times. When I created this campaign, that's what it stood for. And I created them to show in a glimpse that the scale of death we were resulting in because we were banking on extinction. I think I meant commoditization. Sorry. Sometimes I get into a verbal clutter when I'm like thinking everything through at once. And here we go with palm oil. Once again, when you buy that point of sale lipstick on your way of checkout at Sephora or anywhere else, are you really looking at where they source their materials from? Do you look at their supply chain? Do you really think about what goes in the products that you feel predisposed to purchase? And are we really giving this notion of freedom that we're so proud of to all living beings? Do we extend the right to be, the right to space to be, to all living organisms? And oftentimes we're not. We're infringing on them in order to thrive at the cost of them. And here, like, I moved more towards solution sets and looking at, okay, instead of focusing on the problem, which is the darkness, the doom and gloom narrative of deforestation, palm oil, monoculture, plantations popping up everywhere, can we look at the heart of the ecosystem that is still extant, that is coexisting in harmony with indigenous tribes? And can we protect that heart, that beating heart that is still extant? Because what remains is worth protecting. Waking up today to do something to help protect and preserve this for future generations retains the magic that we have in our lives right now. If we walk out our doors, it retains it for the next generation. That is a wealth that is worth inheriting. And that's really what I fight for daily. Looking at also, when all these issues occur together, whether it's been arms trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, women's rights, everything occurs simultaneously. They're all sort of interwoven, interdependent, because the mindsets that result in these paradigms usually are extremely exploitative, and they are very self-centric at the cost of all else. It's sort of like everything justifies the profit margin. And that is a very, very shallow way of thinking. And I feel like right now there's more of the mentality of stakeholder capitalism that we're veering toward. And I really do hope that this is the next generation where conscious consumerism is such an active part of our dialogue daily that we don't dismiss our stewardship and our responsibility to the world around us. And that means investing back in the next generation and allowing them to inherit these inimitable resources that we have taken for granted in this generation. That's what this one just shows you, is like South Africa saving a whole wealth of rhinos for the next generation to inherit. Because ultimately it's a face-off, right, between the sustainable way of doing things versus the consumptive, profit-driven, myopic way of doing things. And in between those two mind states is nature, just on its own, doing its thing, trying its very best to thrive. And all we need to do is make space for it. The reason there is so much conflict in the world is because there's so much conflict within us. And humanity brings about that which it is. And so we each have a role in shaping the world that we are living in, because it is the way it is because of you, because of me, because of everybody else around us. And if each of us shows up more responsibly right now, the world can shift. You know, you need not continue this butterfly effect of creating consequences that we may not even get to perceive because it's not happening in our own backyard, right? Because it affects and ripples through the entire world. Because whether we like to see it or not, the overarching effect is that we live in one planet. It's one biosphere. We're not separate from one another. It doesn't matter where you live in this world. It doesn't matter how far away you live from me. I still have to make choices that are responsible because they might affect you. And that's something that people should be conscious of. And the other idea that I try to focus a lot on is climate change, simply because that is such a pressing reality that we do not have a tangible grasp of, because again, like the butterfly effect, what you do in your immediate backyard may not boomerang within a short enough timeline for our minds to be able to grasp the impact of what we have just done. And so people continue to emit, people continue to consume without realizing that what they're doing here is going to affect, you know, ice cover elsewhere. It's going to affect snowfall elsewhere. It's going to result in droughts elsewhere. And we are all interdependent, interconnected. Bringing back to another form of consumerism, what you eat, right? Which I spoke about earlier. This is an illustration of plankton making up a blue whale. Like, living organisms are so mindful. Like blue whales, for instance, poop in upwellings in the ocean so that they can fertilize. They're like the earliest farmers. They fertilize their own plankton blooms so they can consume their food. They grow their own food, essentially. And we don't seem to have the sensitivity to think through cradle to cradle on every one of our processes. We tend to do something and then we forget about the waste impact of it altogether. That's a very poorly designed product, very poorly designed life cycle for that product. And it's a very ineffectual way. It's a very wasteful way, even in terms of energy and resources consumed in creating it, right? Like, it just is waste that we don't reclaim because we don't think waste is treasure. We don't think of it as useful when it actually is. Everything can be repurposed, and that's what nature does. And so I say, like, with pictures, you know, I love this quote that I put here. It says, "I don't trust words, I trust pictures." And it's because words can be so subjective. We can each interpret it in so many different ways. And a picture can be too. But at the end of the day, when you see something, when that feeling that it evokes is so instinctive, it's so immediate, and we all have sort of the same bandwidths of emotional experience in the world through whatever we've been through, that would trigger the same sorts of responses within us, because that's what it means to be human. So I do trust pictures in that capacity. And I would say in the end, you know, like right now, it's really an unfortunate skew, because the people who have the buying power that are resulting in the worst impacts in the world, it's largely in North America and Western Europe. 60% of the private consumption spending comes from here, right? And most of the world lives in poverty. They live in less than $2 a day and don't have the buying power to result in the kind of consequences that we're causing for all of them. So they're just paying the dues without having enjoyed the benefits, so to speak. And I wouldn't even call what we're doing beneficial, because we're really just being indulgent and easily entertained by poor choices. So I'm really looking at creating infrastructure, which you are more than welcome to look up. It's called Incorporate, INCOPERATE.com. We haven't launched the application just yet. We'll be doing so shortly. But Incorporate, because we care how everybody operates once they've incorporated. Like, you come upon brand identity so easily in today's world. Even being on social media as an influencer, you're a brand identity. But like, what matters is what you truly stand for, and what you stand for should be evidenced in how you show up, not in what you say. We spend so much of our time online speaking at one another with very little to show for what those words mean, right? Like, there's no evidence of follow through and follow up on endless exchanges. So much put out there that is just verbiage. So I highly recommend looking at how you can take ownership, how you can be held accountable within your own life, within your own context, but also in the context of the world, and take on as many things as you can, because you're able to. You really are. If I can do it, anyone can, because it happens, you know, just from the shift of perspective from saying it's not my issue to thinking, yes, it is. So take on that responsibility. It will definitely change your life for the better, and countless other lives out there that are depending and waiting for you to wake up. Thank you.
All right. Well, Asher, thank you. Oops. There we go. Asher, thank you so much for sharing that with us today, sharing that message, sharing some of those images. Some of those were new ones that I hadn't seen before. So it was great to see some of the new work. And I look at everything you make, and it just makes such perfect sense for the campaign or the issue that you're trying to spotlight. And I'm always in awe of the way that you think and what you come up with in the end. So what is your process when you're attacking a new campaign, you're attacking a new issue that you want to highlight? Is it a long process, or do you quickly come across those ideas? How do you attack something like global warming or something like the ivory trade, which I know you've done in the past?
Well, right now I'm working on a campaign with IUCN for the planet as a migratory organism as a whole, right? Like everything within it is in movement. And it's a really interesting way of looking at where do we stop the flow of existence? Where do we cessate the capacity to move? Because when we take away the wildlife corridors that allow for organisms to migrate from one habitat area to another, because we have geographically isolated everything by infringing and pilfering into every ecosystem out there, that's something to look at, because then we're not working with the natural state of the planet, which is that the planet is in a constant state of movement. So where are our activities and imprints affecting that flow? And that's really what I'm looking at. So my process right now is to wait for the client, which is IUCN, to send me all of the information on what it is that they want to communicate in bullet points. And then I break it down into words that absolutely need to get conveyed in a glimpse. And then I look at what are the visual motifs that would relate to those concepts or to those words. And then what are the colors or images that they've already utilized in their past communications? Can I be in the same vein of that so it doesn't look dissonant with their brand? And then I look at the through line of what about this whole topic and about their paper affects me the most. And then I condense that into a visual. And usually there'll be like moments of just spontaneous connection with life around me, where I'll see somebody driving and wearing a striped shirt and think, oh my gosh, like that stripe really inspires me with the notion of movement that we think in variegated thought, you know. And then I look at sort of linear movement versus the movement of line in nature, which is more branched. And so, yeah, so my mind just works with lateral association, and that's how I find connections and build a campaign.
All right. So there's definitely that collaboration then between the organization, like something like the IUCN, where you can kind of draw on some of their past campaigns or kind of see the direction that they're going. So there is a little bit of collaboration through the process too.
Absolutely. And then I also look at, you know, people always think like, oh, I'm doing this, but I can't do that. Like I just had a conversation with an investor who was like, I want to get more into visual campaigning and art, but I've been in investment my whole life. How could I do that? And I'm like, why can't you? Because it really is about integrating what experience you've had with what you can bring to the table that will allow for something to get communicated in a manner that is unique to you, right? And so I think people can all be empowered to bring their 2 cents to the table the best they know how, and think about it synergistically. It doesn't matter what line of work you're in right now. Like right now with IUCN campaign, I'm still going to integrate that back into the application I'm working on. So it all comes together if you choose to bring it together, or it can remain segmented and you're like, oh, I'll just make it a tax deduction, or I'll just give back to this one cause at the end of the year. It's not that far removed from daily participation. It's just a matter of, again, taking responsibility.
Yeah.
And thinking holistically.
So the question that I have now is, you know, your art progresses, it changes with time, it changes with access to new technology. So, you know, what has led you to start exploring the blockchain NFT space for going forward?
Because I don't think it's being utilized in the way that can affect the most amount of change in the world. And oftentimes I've been told repeatedly the things that I do are literally the most obvious things. In fact, when I've pitched my application, every investor has been like, there has to be something else like this that exists, but it doesn't. So I feel like I end up saying the most obvious thing or doing the most obvious thing, and it's the thing that's most needed. But we all assume that everyone knows that thing, and therefore no one says it or does it. And so it's just taken for granted and leaves this massive market gap that is worth addressing. So I always look at the building blocks, like I say, plot it, which is what is the problem, define the problem set, what language does it need to be communicated in, what are the obvious emotional aspects within it that need to get conveyed, like what is the most obvious thing about that needs to get relayed in order for it to have the most amount of change possible through it being the vehicle. And then last thing would be triggers, like what are the triggers you can incite or address by putting this particular product or a campaign out into the world. And so I'm like, I always look at what is the most obvious version of it that doesn't exist. And that's literally what I'm creating right now.
All right. Well, I'm excited to see where you take it because, like you said, there's a lot of different opinions about NFTs, about blockchain. A lot of it is ill-informed. People hearing little snippets and not hearing kind of the whole story behind it. So I'm excited to see where you take it.
Yeah, people follow me on Medium. I am posting articles that will give you sort of a different look at how blockchain, NFTs, and everything can be utilized. And I also encourage everybody to go and create their own things. It's not like you have to follow in my vein of thinking. But if you are interested in what I'm putting out soon, feel free to sign up on incorporate.com as well. And I'm happy to keep tabs with anybody who's interested. So look forward to taking the conversation forward.
All right. Well, throw up some handles there as well, Twitter and Instagram. I'm sure you'll do some posts there that can kind of drive people back to some of those sites as well.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, Asher, thank you so much for connecting today. Where in the world are you today?
So I'm currently in Montana, but I'm moving to LA soon. So we'll be leaving a new lease on life shortly, probably in the next month. So if you guys are in California, hit me up.
All right. Well, Asher, great to see you as always. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, taking us into your world. And I can't wait for our next connection.
Yeah, right back at you, Joe. Thank you for having me. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Asher.